California, Irvine, which is a very, very, very nice place, right? If you don't know Irvine, you should check. Irvine is one of the best places. Now, like yesterday, I talked to Alex during there are a lot of heat waves recently, right? But Irvine is one of the few places which does not be affected too much by the weather. It's all the year round, like nice weather, about 20-some degree, right? Yeah. So then let's introduce a bit more for Alex. Alex research focused on marine modeling biosphere interactions that control the reactive trace gas and the particle distribution in the atmosphere. Professor in the Earth System Science Department at the UC Irvine, he advances understanding of atmospheric composition and its impact on climate ecosystem, from urban forests to remote Arctic tundra and Amazon rainforest. Field study across several continents. He's a fellow of AAAS, ATU, also got numerous awards, also a highly researcher. I remember one time that's a special award, actually, not in the you received what they call is that something like a generous collaboration, something right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the full name of that? Yeah, Alex is a very, very generous researcher and generous man. Because of his generous collaboration and help to the world's scientists. So their award is specifically awarded to him for generous help to others. That's kind of very special award. And he is also the chair of ICBP Gaia. So today we'll talk about again still his famous topic is biogenic VOC emissions in a changing world, consequences for air quality and climate. Okay, now first, welcome.
Thanks so much, Yang. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talk with you. And first of all, to learn from you. So I've been learning about some of the work here. I also want to share with you. Start it again. Click on it. So, so the question that I'll be addressing is how these BVOC emissions are changing, and why that's important. What the impact of that is. So I'll start with a little bit of background. What are these BVOC emissions? How does it impact air quality and climate? And then finally, why are these changes? Why do we think that changes are happening? And so here we can see some different sources of these biogenic VOC. And so these are compounds you're familiar with, right? As you walk through the beautiful landscape on campus here, or you're in your kitchen cooking, the smells that you smell are BVOCs, right? Those are BVOCs, and all the plant molecules. These are BVOCs. On global scales, about 90% of all VOC going in the atmosphere are these BVOCs. And so come from a lot of different sources. Some of them are very specific. Certain smells, like the smell of a mushroom, fungus, you know that odor, and that's octanol, a BVOC. Many of them are profile. A lot of plants emit many different VOC. One thing I want to point out is that of growing importance are BVOCs that are coming from bottles. We consider these anthropogenic because they're coming from the products we use for people. But really, they're the same BVOCs. So the fumulene is in hops. We use to make their IPAs. Had some very nice Qingdao IPAs. I was happy to see that the Qingdao brewery now is making more than lagers. But that's and it's the same compound. Our Canadian agents often have pine smells or lemon smells. That's coming from a natural product, but we consider it anthropogenic because it's in a bottle. It's one of the things that we use. That's becoming more and more important as we reduce the other views. But you know, the idea that we call this anthropogenic, these compounds, think about these emissions out here as anthropogenic because somebody planted these trees out here. If we're in an urban area, then all the BVOC are really managed BVOC, and maybe we should be thinking about it that way. Something we need to think about is why are the plants doing this? It's something we don't understand perfectly, but we have a good idea. In many cases, it's the things you're familiar with, pollinators. We know flowers emit VOC because they're trying to attract pollinators or seed dispersers. But we think the most important reason is defense, to protect the plants. It's to defend the plants. Many different ways. It can include actually being toxic compounds. It could be that they're trying to bring in predators to kill the plants that are chewing on the plant, or to kill insects chewing on the plants. And some may protect from viruses that the plants get. But two things I want you to know about that is one, that means that these BVOC have a positive role for the plants. That they can't just get rid of it. They may need those BVOC. It's important for them. Second is that if these BVOC are protecting for stress, we should expect more stress, more BVOC, right? So probably it will increase with stress. So those are two important points. Now, another thing we want to know for modeling purposes is how many of these BVOC we need to account for, because there are a lot of them, thousands of different chemical species, thousands of BVOC. In our models right now, in a model like Megan, we have 200, which is a lot, far more than what's in the atmospheric chemistry models. They may only have about 30 or something like that. So I think we're doing pretty good at getting most of the important chemical species. Also, we find that on a global scale, there's only about 20. About 20 will make up 95%. So the other 180 are very small. So why do we care about them? Well, on a global scale, maybe there's only 20, but locally, maybe here in Qingdao, maybe one of those 180 is dominant, right? So there's such diversity. So in different parts of the world, maybe some of these minor compounds are very important, even if they're not on a global scale. So then now on to the next question. That was the background. Now, how can they impact air quality and climate? So one of the key things that mostly atmospheric scientists have studied this for is their impact on ozone and OH, because that's important for air quality and climate. And then the impact on small particles, fine particles. And so that's important also for air quality and climate. Compounds like isoprene and alpha-pinene are very important for this. So the air quality that's a problem, right? They're making pollutants. They're making pollutants. With climate, it's a little more complicated. So the ozone is a greenhouse gas, but the particles actually will actually cool the climate. So that that makes it challenging. It's going in different directions. There's also air toxics. So compounds with ozone particles, that's a secondary impact. Isoprene and alpha-pinene are not very toxic themselves. They're not a problem. But other compounds like formaldehyde and toluene, they're toxic compounds. So they're directly toxic compounds. They're carcinogens. And they're emitted by plants. They're produced by the oxidation of other BV. In general, it's been considered not very important. It's small compared to other air toxics. But as we've cleaned up the environment, now in the US, the air toxics from the BVOC are one of the dominant air toxics because we've cleaned up the other things so well. So it's something that we're trying to understand better now. Then finally is the idea that these BVOC are positive. They're actually good for your health. That's not a new idea. So that goes back thousands of years, both in Europe, also here in Asia. People have had the idea that both for mental health, if you go out in the forest, you smell these compounds, you feel better. Your mental health improves, right? That helps the person, but also your physical health. So there's the idea that these compounds, which are toxic to viral, fungus, other things, are actually helping you, So that makes it even more complicated. So now we say, well, we're making ozone particles, that's bad for our health, but others would say, no, wait, it's also making your health better. So this makes it complicated. Another complication is that the impacts on those pollutants, ozone and particles, also depends on the chemical regime and where you are. And in a clean environment, these compounds go into the atmosphere, they get oxidized mostly down to small particles, CO2, taken back up by the ecosystem. They don't cause a problem. So in a clean environment, they're not causing ozone and particles. They're not causing pollutants. But in a dirty environment, something very different. So these BVOC mixed with oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, in our dirty environment that we have around our cities, and then they make lots of ozone and particles. But again, complicated because it depends on the chemical regime we're in. Now, ozone and SOA are very difficult to control. Other air pollutants are not so difficult. Lead emissions, well, we stopped emitting lead. We stopped using gasoline with lead and we got rid of the lead. Ozone and particles, really difficult. Why is that? We don't emit ozone and fine particles. It gets produced in the atmosphere from many things, and it's complicated. So for a long time in cities in Asia, North America, Europe, we've been trying to get rid of, get ozone and fine particles to a safe level. Not much progress in recently in the US. You can see in California, it's just flat. And in fact, in some places, it's getting worse. In Asia, it's getting worse, especially as you clean up the particle pollution. There's more sunlight and you're getting more ozone. So this is difficult. Even though we cleaned up the air, it's not improving these ozone. So one of the things that's happening is that the BVOC impacts we've been interested in for a long time, but mostly we're interested where pollutants from the city went downwind to the forest, and those pollutants mixed with the BVOC downwind of the forest. So that's what we focused on. Now, though, we're seeing, and so that's kind of what it looked like up here. And so we go down to the rural area, downwind, you're making lots of ozone. Well, now as we clean up the cities, NOx is going down, but also what else is happening in our cities? Many cities, especially in China, have much more urban greening, more vegetation, so more BVOC. So we've been cleaning up the other sources, more BVOC, so it's starting to look like this. Well, you only produce ozone when you have a certain level of VOC to NOx. Now we're getting that level in the urban areas because you reduce the NOx and we're increasing the VOC. And so now rural areas, it's becoming less of a problem, so that's good. But now in the urban area, we're making ozone. So why? Why is that? Well, so this increase is happening for a number of reasons. But first, thinking about, well, why, what is the impact then of urban greening on ozone? As I said before, it's complicated. Just the BVOC part is complicated, what the impact is. But it's more complicated because there's also deposition. So we all know that trees take up pollutants, right? So that's a good thing about trees. And much of the urban greening taking place, that's the reason. People say we need trees to take up the pollutants, and it's true that they do. But there's been some questions now about whether that's really the case, that whether they're improving the air quality. So if the pollution is somewhere else and the trees over above me, like right here, well, then the trees are helping me. They're filtering out that pollution. But in a case like this in the lower picture there, if the pollution like is coming from cars and the trees are overhead, what is it doing? It's actually trapping the pollution down near where helping us. And then we have those negative impacts, right? So may not air quality as much as we think, but it's important what kind of tree we have. The tree you see or not see in our with a because we didn't even try in the cities. We thought it wasn't important, but now we think it's important. And so less than a meter, if you get down to less than a meter, you can do individual trees. You can do really trees. The LAI from the satellites don't work that well. LAIs, we've developed inventory. So a lot of cities now already are developing inventories. And then we need to understand urban stress. We know stress increases BVOCs. And so we're looking at different kinds of urban stresses. Okay, so assuming that we can actually map out and we can actually keep track of the BVOC emissions, then we need to think about how could they be controlled? How can we control these BVOC emissions? And there are a number of ways we could reduce stress, but probably choosing trees that are low BVOC emitters would be the best way to do it. And that could be implemented in various ways with taxes, with bans, but this is possible, right? This is already done for other reasons that we control and manage the trees, and this would just be another reason. But it does require knowing what trees are the low emitting trees, right? Well, people have been measuring emission factors, putting them in models for decades, or maybe the last 40 years. We've been doing this, But I would say that actually we have some problems for this. You know, we have data, but mostly it's for forests. It's not for urban trees. So we have very little data, and we have no protocol like we do for car emissions. And so a lot of the data, I think, is not very good or inaccurate. The other is that we have problems that people will go out and make measurements on trees, but sometimes with some kinds of emissions, if the tree is shaded or not, will make a difference. And people don't keep track of that. So that's a problem. There's a problem that with some trees, by just putting an enclosure on the tree, you'll change the emissions. It causes a disturbance, just like you can smell, if you rub some foliage, you can smell it. So we think that there's a lot of contamination in the data from this. And then finally, there's the question of, we need to think about the emission at what kind of conditions. So what we do for our global models, we say at 30 degrees C, that's the temperature we use. That's our emission factor. And if you look at 30 C pine trees, we have some pine trees here on campus, their emission would be much higher than, say, a juniper tree, right? So if you were selecting a tree, what would you choose? You would choose the juniper tree. The juniper tree has less emissions than the pine tree, right? So that's easy. But here's the thing, at 30 C, that's the case. At 40 C, these junipers have much, much higher emissions. They cross kind of a stress threshold. We think it breaks down barriers for their emissions. So it's much higher. So at 40 C, pines are better. So which one do you choose? A lot of our, 30 C, of course, that happens much more. It's pretty hot here, but not 40 C most of the time. On the other hand, many of our air pollution episodes are high. That happens at high temperatures, at very high temperatures. So maybe 40 C really is the one we should choose. But anyway, we don't have data on this. There's almost no data on what trees emit at 40 C or during our worst air pollution conditions, right? That's where we should be selecting emission factors. Okay, so I want to finish this with thinking about more large scales, about what's driving emissions. So for a long time, we've had global models and estimates, but they were just static inventories. So we had static inventories that people could use, but we recognize now these emissions we think may be changing, right? We can't just have one static inventory. And this US 30 years, we can't just think about today. We should be designing air quality for the future, right? We got to think about the future, how things are going to change. So they had an effort. We had 4 different groups, did some modeling. And what you're looking at here, red is a future increase in emissions, and then the yellow-green is a decrease. So if you look at these maps, one thing you see is they all predict changes. They all say there are going to be big changes in the next 50 years in BVOC emissions. They agree on that. But look at the maps. They look very different. So they don't even agree how it's going to change. And so actually this bottom one was the group that I was working with. I put that blue circle there so you can compare different regions. If you look at that with the one above it, completely different changes, where one says increase, the other says decrease. We don't even know what direction it's going. So they all agree on big changes, but we don't know what that change is going to be. More recently, this is part of the CMIP-6, so Global Earth System Climate Model Comparison. And in this case, there were 11 models, but they had these 5 different ways of doing BVOC emissions. So the models did BVOC in 5 different ways, and they weren't even really all that different. I would really say was more or less 3 different ways they did it. One is they used the estimates that we came up with 30 years ago. They used that and they just had it change with temperature. Secondly, they used the Megan 2.1 model that we've developed. And then third, there's the UK model, right? So those are the differences. Even with just that, the fact that mostly they're using about the same model, still the conclusion from this is that these future responses are all different. And these differences have a big impact on predictions of ozone and particles and their impacts on radiative forcing. So basically saying the BVOC changes are important, but they're so different and it's affecting our answers. It's affecting our climate predictions. So we need to understand this better. And there was this study came out though. So that one group, the European group that had a different model, these lines here, one is they have a blue line there. Left is ice spring change, right is monoterpene change. And the blue line is where they just looked at climate. Then the green line is they looked at climate and CO2 influence. So CO2 directly influences the emissions of these BVOC. And what they said is that it's not going to change. They say the climate is going to increase emissions, the CO2 is going to decrease emissions, and there's really no change. Therefore, we don't really need to worry about changes, right? That's not important. So we've been looking at, trying to carefully look at that and see, is that the case, right? So we're looking at all the different drivers, 4 main processes driving these changes: the CO2 inhibition, vegetation amount, the temperature, and then stress, right? Those are the key things. So how are they going to impact things? And all the numbers I'm going to show are percent change per decade. Try to put everything onto the same numbers so we can compare these. What's the percent change per decade? So starting with the CO2 inhibition. So this is a biochemical plant physiology thing. With more CO2, they change their BVOC production. And so if we go back 20 years, these first were introduced into the models. There were 2 different ones. On the right is the one that work I did with Colette Heald, and then the left is European groups. They're quite different. So they came up with -6% per decade. We had -3%. So they had a much larger decrease. Well, more recently, there have been more studies done that suggest that -6% is definitely too high. And in fact, most of the responses they saw was 0.4 to 3%. So even the one we were using, the 3%, is probably too high. And so the CO2 inhibition is not going to stop the change from temperature. It's just not going to do it based on this. And even more so, there are studies that came out that said, oh, and also as temperature increases, CO2 inhibition of BVOC is going to decrease even more. So the conclusion here is that CO2 inhibition is not going to have a big impact that other people predicted. You know, they thought about 6% per decade. And we'd say it's going to be very little. So then vegetation, okay? So we think CO2 inhibition is not going to do anything. Vegetation, what's going on there? You know, we've had in the world a big change from a lot of forests going to cropland, right? It's happened in the last 1,000 years or so. We did a study looking at, this was Wei-Hua Chen at Jinan University. We looked at ground surveys and satellite data, essentially concluded that currently we've probably had about a 1% decrease per decade. So small but significant in the last few decades. But we actually think in the future, this is hopefully will turn around, right? We're hoping that deforestation in the tropics is going to kind of stabilize, and reforestation in places like China and temperate world is increasing. So probably not much of a change there. But now, so one thing we think, there probably will continue to be deforestation in the tropics, but there's going to be reforestation in other places, and maybe in the tropics. So what's that going to be? How will that impact BVOC? People have proposed planting 1 trillion trees. We probably used to have 5 trillion trees on the planet. We're down to 3 trillion. Maybe it'll go back to 4 trillion. Is that going to increase emissions 33%, or is it going to be 83%, right? Well, it's pretty simple math. It seems like it should be 33%, shouldn't it? If we go from 3 trillion to 4 trillion, you'd think 33%. But remember, different trees have very different BVOC emissions. So it's going to depend on what kind of trees we plant. So why do I think that maybe it'll be an 83% increase? Well, the reason is that we think most of these trees being planted tend to be very high BVOC emitting trees. They tend to be isoprene emitters. They have maybe 10 times the emission of these other trees. We don't understand completely why, but we do think that actually these BVOC help the pioneering species, the species that grow well under stress, for example. So they tend to be ones we plant in our cities because they can live in our cities. They can live in a stressful environment in our cities. They're ones that we plant out in open areas because they can live in high light, high temperature environments. So this could be a very large increase depending on what trees we plant. Another thing I want to point out is that in a lot of models, people have forest landscapes going to croplands and going from high emissions to low emissions. We actually think in some places, and that probably is what happens in China and the US. We go from a forest land to a cropland. But we think that in a lot of tropical areas where you have cropland being developed, this is maybe not the case. This is work led by Yang Liu in Kenya, and we've done other measurements in South America where we see the same thing. And actually, what we call cropland areas there actually have a lot of BVOC emissions. And the reason is they don't completely cut the whole forest down and plant some single crop. What they do is they clear out some trees, they plant some crops, they leave other trees for shade. So there's actually a lot of the trees, and the ones they leave tend to be the higher emitters. So these croplands may actually have pretty high emissions compared to rice paddies in China and wheat fields in the US. So we need to understand this better. Finally, need to keep in mind that besides us cutting trees down and planting crops, that vegetation changes with climate. And there's some interesting studies that suggest in a hotter climate, the high emitters will do better because it's actually helping protect them from stress. So in the natural forest, say in the Amazon rainforest, maybe, and this will be hundreds of years, to change, you'll have more high emitters. This is work that Ty Taylor did, and looking across the Amazon, and areas that were warmer had more high emitting trees, high BVOC trees. Okay, then real quickly, just a little bit about the climate part, and I'm going to focus on temperature here. One of the interesting things that we saw in the past decade, our colleagues in Copenhagen had did some work up in the Arctic, and they found that 260% increase in BVOC in these chambers that just warmed a couple, 2 to 3 degrees. We thought, wow, 1 degree temperature change is doubling emissions. That's incredible. How could that be the case? And we had some ideas, and we thought maybe they were doing some things wrong. So we went up there to the US part of the Arctic, and they were in the Greenland part. We went up to Alaska, really nice field sites up there. Grad students, Wei Wong, Chris Long, Allison Welch. And so we studied both. Allison is looking at the types of vegetation, because we thought, well, one thing that's maybe happening is there's a shift in the vegetation. You're getting more shrubs, and those are the high emitters. But then we also looked at the temperature responses of the different vegetation types. And so one thing we looked at are the willows. So the willows are shrubs, and we knew the willows were high emitters, and they're one of the major emitters up there. And so we looked at their short-term temperature response. If you change temperature over the order of hours, and it looked just like what we had in the model. So it increases, but nothing unexpected. So then we looked at the long term. So this is the temperature of the last few days. If you have some warm weather, then what happens? We found that this increase was much higher than expected. So if it warms up a little bit during the past week, they emit a lot more than the model expects. So this explained part of the increase, but not all of it. So the other thing is we looked at the grasses up there. There's sedges, and these are really high emitters also. So they're the second major source up there. What we found with the sedges, and so the green is the model there. What we found out in the field, a much higher response. It's a higher exponential response, and it just keeps going up. And so these two together explains this high increase. Sedges and willows are not just in the Arctic, they're in other places too, places like China. So we'd expect it to happen there as well. And then finally, just about stress. So I mentioned stress, very important for these BVOC. We've been studying what happens, for example, high temperature stresses, and we find that with some plants, they'll just increase as expected, as the model predicts, but with others, they'll hit a threshold, maybe around 38C, something like this, and then just they go up by a factor of 100 or 1,000. What we think is going on there is that we're actually breaking down. You can see here these increases 3,000-fold. In some cases, they continue for days. In other cases, they'll peak and start coming down, but they're still increased by a factor of 100, right? Well, this is huge. So that means if we were predicting the estimates here in Qingdao, and then this happened, we'd be off by a factor of 100. So we need to understand this better. And what we think is happening is actually a physical breaking down of the barriers. So plants store these in essential oils in the bark and in the foliage. And at these very high temperatures, the barriers break down and it just all starts evaporating and going out. A similar thing can happen then with cold stress. And so we've been looking at this more, trying to quantify this. But it should also say, so some of these will increase 100-fold, 1,000-fold, others decrease. Some BVOC emissions like isoprene will decrease during these stresses. And then ozone, I won't go into detail here, but the same thing with ozone. Under high ozone conditions, some emissions like isoprene can decrease, others increase. It appears to be really complicated. Different plant species will have different increases. Here there are 4 different plant species, each one, and then there are 4 different compound groups. It's different for each plant, which compounds increase. But in general, there's clearly increases. There's clearly increases for a lot of BVOC. So we put all this together. What do we get? We predict on totaling all those up. We think an increase. But we think now the best estimates is not 0, as the other groups had suggested. We think maybe something like 10% a decade, but maybe as high as 20% a decade. So these could be significant, right, if we're trying to predict future air quality. There are also feedbacks that we think are interesting, since the BVOC can impact ozone, and because ozone can impact BVOC, there can be a feedback. What I think is interesting is that in clean air, in the natural environment, that's a negative feedback. So that's good. A negative feedback means you increase a little and then it'll decrease it. But in polluted air, it's a positive feedback. We think the same thing for drought. In clean air or under mild droughts that you would naturally have, it's a negative feedback. But in polluted air, under the current extreme droughts we have, it's a positive feedback. So we're throwing the whole system out. But of course, we don't understand this very well. We need to understand it better. And I'll just finish with the computer gave me some new fonts here. Is there any evidence of this, right? So on large scales. So a lot of this is very small scale observations. Well, one, satellite data is now improving a lot. Geostationary satellites, higher resolution, better accuracy, more calibrated, really getting to the point where we can now start to look at these. Even in the past, though, we could see things like our model-based increases in the Arctic, where we say, hey, it looks like it's increasing a lot, seem to agree pretty well with the satellites. So that's giving us some assurance. Now, another thing is long-term data. We can put flux systems up on forests and run it for years, right? With CO2 and energy fluxes, people have been doing this for hundreds of years. The FluxNet, they have 1,500 site years of data for CO2, temperature, and water from maybe something like 212 sites. Now with BVOC fluxes, we have a lot of sites. People have done these measurements on a lot of sites, unfortunately, for a very short period of time. Why is that? Well, the equipment's expensive, it's difficult to maintain, it takes power, so people go for a week or two and stop. What we really need, though, is long-term measurements. This plot that I'm showing here is how the technology has developed, and so it's really have amazingly good technology, but we have really expensive instruments that are difficult to do long-term. What I think we need, I think it's possible to do low cost, low power flux measurements. So we've worked on developing technology for that. It doesn't get us all the compounds. It's not as good detection limit, but it's something we could put on these CO2 flux towers around the world and start getting data sets. Until then, we're never going to be able to look at long-term changes if we don't have these kind of data sets. And I'll just finally say also with aircraft flux measurements, the same kind of thing. So we have great technology. We can put on aircraft, we can fly all around, we can see the differences in landscapes, croplands versus urban areas versus forests, and say what the differences are. This would help us understand how land management will affect things. But there have only been 8 in the world, starting with work we did when I was at INCAR in 1996. These were not very good systems though, but they were initial data. They gave us a little bit of data. The systems we have now give us lots of data on lots of compounds, but it's expensive. Not very many people are making these measurements. We need more of these kinds of studies. And that's the end there. I'll leave with my key points and happy to answer any questions.
Very comprehensive talk. New information, basic. So
So that from the 9% was the overall with everything, climate, land management, and everything. Yeah, but land management locally would have the biggest effect, right? So in cities in China where you have all the urban greening, that's probably more than 10% a decade.
we know Alex is because of Megan.
Yeah.
So I just want to read these stories like you can do. This is very
Yeah.
they use the Megan. So okay, this is just any questions?
I was going to say on that point. So I like to tell a student. So I probably spent 80% of my effort in my career on measurements, but I'm 80% known for the modeling work. But I think the key is doing both. It doesn't mean you yourself have to do both, right? But you need to be working together. If you do, the models can't do anything new or interesting if there aren't new measurements, right? So the modelers absolutely need the measurements. But if you do just measurements, publish a measurement paper, the reality is rarely does that get much notice, right? It doesn't get a lot of interest. The ones that get cited, that get a lot of interest are the modeling ones. So you want to position yourself to be the bridge between those two worlds, or working somewhat in both of those worlds to be successful.
Any questions?
Noticed in your slide that the carbon dioxide inhibits the aspirin emission.
Yeah.
I think the fertilization of the CO2 and what is the role of the fertilization effect, which is promote the growth primary productivity like LAI, TPP.
Right. Yeah. So you're right. So there, CO2 is doing two things there, which see it here. Yeah. So right here you can see the CO2 box. There's this CO2. So as you have more CO2, you have more leaves on the trees. So you have more emission source. And the models actually account for that. I don't know how well they account for that. The models like CEM actually, if you increase the CO2, you have more. If you run the dynamic vegetation model, you will get more vegetation. And that's significant. So that's also part of why I think there's not going to be steady, right? That some people claim. Because you're right, that CO2 increasing the foliage, that's also going to add a 1% or something like that per year. But the CO2 inhibition is the idea that higher CO2 changes the biochemistry within the leaf. And the biologists don't perfectly understand it, but what happened, there's several theories. But in each theory, the idea is that as you get more CO2, then the carbon that's being fixed starts getting shunted to other things. They start putting it into other products and not into BVOC. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
Like some online, they have some.
你直接说可以听到。
向下面先问，然后你。这个信息可能这个就是限制。
哎，高老师、谢老师，聊天区好像有一个问题。
哦，您能看到是？我这怎么这看不到？您能看到是吧？
对，我截个图我发给谢老师和您。
啊，你发给我吧，发给我。
哎，好嘞。哎，高老师，我发到了您的微信，您看能看到吗？
And all the and that's like this. Click on that. Yeah, so like right here, so there's kind of two cases there. We have in one case, here, starting like around 30, starts around 38. 38 stop. Okay, it'll be a very large increase. But if you can come up to 40, 42, then you're up like 1,000 in this case. But then when it's really high, typically you kind of come here and start going down, you're still after, well, this is like 12 hours, days. 10 or 100. This is just going up to 40. Days, even up to 100. And we think it's just the way that the storage structures are built. Some plants, this doesn't happen. Like plant trees, it doesn't. So it's just you get to these late 40 is okay, 38, 40 is okay, it'll stay. But if you keep going 45, that are produced and emitted, so the influence of the plant that produces them. Survive that. Very hot weather. It's outside the normal weather that it sees. Then interesting questions are UCI. My colleague Celia Fanola is looking at this right now and doing some. So, one of the things that we expect happens is that you could actually clog with fine particles. We don't know. It's an interesting question. At this point, we really don't know whether they think we're not really industry. But we need to experiment. Yeah, Celia's been doing some work on that. We may know. Yeah, it's a good question. I think a good thing to be getting into. I think the marine BVOC, obviously people have studied it for a long time. They haven't, other than DMS studies for the other BVOCs. What has been done is really, but we know much. Are the changes in the ocean, are they driving changes in emissions? Know that, but there's just not enough. The community doing that work is really small and tends to be every 5 or 10 years, maybe. It's really doing that all the time. It's really important. We need to know more about it. Now, I think one potential reason why is, well, if you look at the global total, marine BVOC is negligible. It's nothing compared to the land BVOC. But these, I mean, what I was going to say is if you took just the global total emission, right? The global total isoprene from the ocean is so small to the global that some people would say, oh, it's not important. But that doesn't matter. So the point is, and maybe what you're thinking, that doesn't matter. Isoprene has a lifetime of an hour or two, right? So who cares about the global total? What you care about is that 70% of the Earth is dominated by marine isoprene, right? So from that point of view, you should care very much about the marine. But if you take the total emission, it's 500 teragrams of isoprene from land. I think from the ocean, it's maybe 1% or something, maybe 5, 10 teragrams or something like that. But what's important is the impacts. The impacts that the marine BVOC have are tremendous. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. And so I think some people would think, oh, we don't have to worry the concentration of both, but that's not what's important. The impacts. Yeah. I agree completely. Yeah, so that's what I say. I agree completely. But I think maybe that's part of why people aren't studying it, right? Because it doesn't seem like it's a big global total, but who cares? What's important is that it's impacting this whole region, 70% of the Earth. That's the most important emission. Is what's coming from there. So it's absolutely, we need to know more about it. We've done some work with Korean Copri doing some measurements. They have an icebreaker that goes pole to pole every year. So we've been doing some measurements on there, and we see, as other people have, monoterpenes, significant. Also, if we do
the seminar, we can continue the discussion. So let's thank Alex again.
thanks.